Temple Israel is a Reformed Jewish congregation in Memphis, Tennessee, in the United States. It is the only Reformed synagogue in Memphis, the oldest and largest Jewish congregation in Tennessee, and one of the largest Reformed congregations in the U.S. It was founded in 1853 by mostly German Jews as Congregation B'nai Israel, Hebrew for Children of Israel. Led initially by cantors, in 1858 it hired its first rabbi, Jacob Perez, and leased its first building, which it renovated and eventually purchased. Perez was fired in 1860 because he opened a store that conducted business on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath. He was replaced by Simon Tuska, who moved the congregation from Orthodox to Reform practices. Tuska died in 1871, and was succeeded by Max Samfield. Under his leadership, the synagogue was one of the founding members of the Union for Reform Judaism. In 1884, Children of Israel completed a new building, and membership grew rapidly. Samfield died in 1915, and was succeeded by Bill Fine-Schreiber, an outspoken supporter of women's suffrage and equal rights for African Americans. The following year the congregation moved to a new building, where membership continued to grow. Fine-Schreiber left in 1924, and was succeeded by Harry Edelson. The synagogue experienced difficulty during the Great Depression. Membership dropped, the Congregational School was closed, and staff had their salaries reduced, but conditions had improved by the late 1930s. In 1943 the synagogue changed its name to Temple Israel, and by the late 1940s membership had almost doubled from its low point in the 1930s. Edelson retired in 1954, and was succeeded by Jimmy Wax. Wax became known for his activism during the civil rights movement. Though some members, particularly those whose families had lived in the South for generations, had segregationist views, others were prominent in the fight for black civil rights. During Wax's tenure, most of Temple Israel's members moved far from the existing synagogue, and in 1976 the congregation constructed its current building, closer to where most members lived. Wax retired in 1978, and was succeeded by Harry Danziger, who brought traditional practices back to the congregation. He retired in 2000, and was succeeded by Micah Greenstein. As of 2010, Temple Israel has almost 1,600 member families. Greenstein is the senior rabbi, and the cantorial soloist is Abby Strauss. Early history, 1853 to 1857. Temple Israel was established as the Orthodox Congregation B'nai Israel in 1853 by 36 heads of families, and granted a charter by the state legislature on March 2, 1854. It grew out of Memphis's Hebrew Benevolent Society, established in 1850 by German Jews. The Benevolent Society managed Memphis's Jewish cemetery, supported poor Jews, and conducted high holy day services. The congregation was initially led by part-time cantors. The first was Jonas Levy, who had been hired as cantor and ritual slaughterer. Levy was succeeded by H. Judah and then J. Sternheimer. A Hebrew school was also created, directed by Sternheimer. In 1857, B'nai Israel hired as organist Christopher Philip Winkler, described by Tim Sharp, Dean of Fine Arts at Rhodes College in Memphis, as the Dean of Memphis Musicians. Born in Germany in 1824, he had emigrated to the United States at age 16, and moved to Memphis in 1854. There he taught music, performed, and composed works for B'nai Israel's services. By 1894 he had completed over 850 pieces for the congregation. In its first decades, the congregation worshipped in various locations in downtown Memphis, near the Mississippi River waterfront. It received a $2,000, today $60,000, bequest from the estate of New Orleans philanthropist Judah Toro, and used it to purchase a lot on 2nd Street, but did not feel financially secure enough to build a synagogue, and eventually sold the property. The congregation instead held services in members' homes in 1853, and subsequently, until 1857, rented various premises on Front Street. The Torah funds eventually enabled the members to lease the Farmers and Merchants Bank building at Main and Exchange Streets in late 1857, which they converted to a synagogue. Funds for the renovation were raised by two committees. One solicited donations from all the Israelites in this city, while the other's task was to receive subscriptions from Gentiles. Additional funds were raised by selling members' reserved seats in the new sanctuary. An auction was held on March 18, 1858, in which 50 men's seats were sold for $343, today $9,900, and 44 women's seats for $158, today $4,600. The renovated premises had seating for 150 men and approximately 50 women. In 1860, the congregation contracted to purchase the property. By 1865, it owned it outright and was debt-free. On March 2, 2007, 153 years to the day after the congregation received its charter from the state of Tennessee, a historical marker was erected by the Shelby County Historical Commission, the Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation, and Temple Israel, on the corner where the synagogue had once stood. It described the building as the first permanent Jewish house of worship in Tennessee. Membership in B'nai Israel was restricted to men, and attendance at least, quarterly meetings was mandatory. Men who missed a meeting without a reasonable excuse were fined. The members also instituted rules intended to guard the image of the small Jewish congregation in the eyes of the much larger Christian community. New members had to be approved by a secret ballot, and existing members could blackball candidates. A member could also be suspended or expelled if he acted in a disreputable manner. B'nai Israel was the only Jewish congregation in Memphis, and from the time it was established members were split between traditionalists and reformers. When remodeling their new building, the congregation voted 18-14 to maintain traditional separate seating for men and women. By 1858, with enough funds to hire a full-time spiritual leader, they consulted Rabbi Isaac Leeser, the leader of America's Orthodox Jewish community, but were also in contact with Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise, the leader of America's fledgling Reform movement, who had dedicated B'nai Israel's sanctuary earlier that year. The members had advertised for their first spiritual leader in Wise's newspaper, The Israelite, along with other English-language Jewish newspapers. At the same time they advertised for a kosher butcher. Leeser recommended Jacob J. Perez, an Orthodox rabbi. Perez era, 1858 to 1860. Born and raised in the Netherlands, Perez had been a child prodigy who, before turning 18, had edited a Hebrew grammar, as well as a volume of proverbs written in 5 languages. Upon graduation from high school, he had been given a stipend by William I of the Netherlands to attend the Netherlands Israelitish Seminary, where he pursued both secular and rabbinic studies. He was well versed in mathematics, language, literature and law, and co-founded Perez and McCoo, a legal firm. B'nai Israel hired Perez in December 1858 as cantor and teacher, in English and German, at an annual salary of $600, today $17,000, with perquisites of $400. By comparison, the kosher butcher's salary was $300, not including what he earned killing poultry. Perez also ran the Hebrew school and the choir, and was in effect the rabbi. Under his leadership, the membership took a serious interest in the plight of Jews around the world. For example, at a congregational meeting in January 1860, they gathered money from the members present and B'nai Israel's treasury to assist suffering Moroccan Jews, and created a committee to raise funds throughout Memphis on their behalf. The congregation also moved more towards orthodoxy, and passed a rule stating that only those members who were Sabbath observant could receive Torah honors on the high holy days. Perez did not find his wages sufficient to support himself, his wife, and his 4 children. To supplement his income, he opened a grocery store and a commission business, selling others' goods on consignment, with his brother. As Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, was also the busiest day for commerce, he decided to keep his business open on that day, something forbidden by Jewish law, and at odds with the rule he had championed. Some of congregants objected, and at B'nai Israel's April 1860 quarterly meeting, charges were brought against him. At a subsequent trial at a Jewish court, he was convicted and fired. In response, he sued the congregation in a civil court for lost wages and libel. The precedent-setting case, which reached the Tennessee Supreme Court, was decided in his favor as regards the lost income, but against him regarding libel. The court's ruling was that a religious institution is sovereign, that its laws and regulations are supreme, and that its policies and practices may not be challenged by illegal action in a court of law. In a letter to Rabbi Isaac Leeser in 1862, Perez claimed that he had been framed and that the store was actually run by his brother, just under his name. He writes that the synagogue had accused him of opening on the Sabbath in order to get rid of me. After Perez's dismissal, the members began a search for what they called a moderate reform rabbi. This time, they consulted Wise, not Leeser. The position was advertised in Wise's newspaper as a teacher, preacher, and reader, paying $1,000, today $28,000, per year. Qualifications included the ability to instruct children in Hebrew, lecture once a week in German or English and read the prayers properly. In 1860, they hired Simon Tuska. Perez stayed in Memphis, and the theological tensions within the congregation were resolved when 40 of the more traditional members departed. With Perez as their spiritual leader, they formed the Orthodox Beth Elamet congregation in the early 1860s. This division process was common to many American congregations of the time. Tuska era, 1860 to 1870. Born in Veszprém, Hungary in 1835, Tuska was raised in Rochester, New York, where his father was a rabbi. Simon attended the Rochester Theological Seminary, and upon completion of his studies there in 1858, was sent to the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau to get rabbinic training. He did not graduate from the seminary, instead returning to the United States in 1860 to apply for a position at Congregation Emmanuel of New York, but he was turned down because of his small size and weak voice. He then applied to Temple Israel, where on July 1, 1860, he was unanimously elected and signed a 3-year contract at $800, today $22,000, per year. He proved to be very popular with the congregation. In January 1863, 6 months before the 3-year contract was up for renewal, he was re-elected as rabbi for a 10-year term, and his salary rose to $1,500 per year. Tuska reformed services at B'nai Israel, removing piyutim, liturgical poems, in 1861, adding an organ and mixed-gender choir in 1862, and confirmation ceremonies in 1863. He also shortened the prayer book, adopting Wise's Minhag America version, added a late Friday night service, and created patriotically themed services for Thanksgiving and National Fast Day. When more pews were required to accommodate the worshippers, they were first added to the men's and women's sections, then family pews were added where men and women could sit together. In May 1864, as rabbi of B'nai Israel, he officiated at what may have been the first Jewish wedding in Tennessee. Until that year, Tennessee did not authorize rabbis to perform marriages. He was also involved in the broader Memphis community, and participated in interfaith services. Tuska supported slavery, describing the abolitionist views of Henry Ward Beecher and others as rabid, and like most members of B'nai Israel, after hostilities broke out between the Union and the Confederacy, he supported secession from the Union. More than 10 members of the congregation volunteered for the Confederate Army after war broke out, and they were given special honors and blessings at a ceremony during Sabbath services. Many Memphis schools were forced to close because of the Civil War. In response, B'nai Israel established the Hebrew Educational Institute in 1864. A secular school, it had 100 students, and taught English, Hebrew, German, and French as well as geography and music. Tuska was one of the school's language teachers. Insufficient funding forced its closure in 1868. B'nai Israel had 83 members in 1864. The mortgage on the synagogue building had been paid off by 1865, but by 1867 the synagogue's expenses were exceeding its income. Dues were raised to $4, today $70, per member per month, and the congregation took out a new mortgage. In January 1870, the congregation moved Friday night services to 7:30 p.m. Previously the services had been held just after sunset, in accordance with Jewish law, which had meant late-night services in midsummer, and late afternoon services in midwinter. Several years later High Holy Day services were moved to the same time. That year Tuska began giving his Friday night sermons in English, rather than German. At the end of 1870, Tuska died of a heart attack. Samfield era, 1871–1915. In 1871, the congregation, whose membership by this time had reached 100, elected Max Samfield to succeed Tuska. The son of a rabbi, he was born in 1846 in Markstedt, Bavaria, and was ordained in Germany. He left for the United States in 1867 to be rabbi of B'nai Zion congregation of Shreveport, Louisiana, where he served for 4 years. He had significant competition for the role at B'nai Israel, with at least 10 rabbis applying. Samfield had, however, preached there the Sabbath before the election for a rabbi, and was hired for a 1-year term. A strong proponent of Reform Judaism, he was associated with Wise in founding the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now Union for Reform Judaism, and under his leadership, B'nai Israel became one of its founding members in 1873. He was also president of the Board of Governors of Hebrew Union College, HUC, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was supervisor of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. In 1875, he asked the congregation if he could abandon wearing the traditional head covering while leading the prayers. In response, the members resolved that all men would be required to remove their hats during services. He led the congregation to adopt the Reform movement's new